Radio friends, this is Ben Grauer speaking from NBC's Box J of the Golden Horse Show in San Francisco's War Memorial Opera House. The first official plenary session of the United Nations Conference on International Organization, following yesterday's opening ceremony, is about to begin. The same note of simple dignity which keynoted yesterday's opening ceremony is felt today as the delegates who are assembling in the seats of the Opera House turn to whisper among themselves, to wave a greeting to others of neighboring delegations with whom they are acquainted, and to discuss points which may be brought up by the speakers of the day who will follow. Those speakers are Secretary of State Edward Stettinius of the United States, Foreign Minister T.V. Soong of China, Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden of Great Britain, and Foreign Commissar V.M. Molotov of Russia. These, the key dignitaries of today's opening session, have not yet taken their place on the simple, severely decorated, and impressive stage here of the San Francisco Opera House. They are expected, however, in a few moments when Secretary Stettinius raps the gavel which brings this, the first official business session of the United Nations Conference, to order. The address most eagerly anticipated this afternoon is probably that of Mr. Molotov. Almost overnight, certain observers claim to detect a stiffening in the United States' attitude toward Russian proposals. Since nothing of this kind was visible or audible at the opening ceremony today, naturally, whatever transpired has taken place behind the scene. Correspondents and delegates alike are palpably anxious to discover whether any of this feeling has been transmitted to Foreign Commissar Molotov and whether the reaction to that feeling will be reflected in this address. And curiously enough, it was just some 40 minutes ago when your reporter was able to attend a hastily called press conference in which the Foreign Commissar made his first official appearance before the press here at the United Nations Conference. We assembled at the St. Francis Hotel on some 20 minutes' notice, some 300 or 400 members of the press, and after a delay of just 2 minutes from the appointed hour, a door opened and in strode the figure, soon to be very familiar to us, of Commissar Molotov. He's a man about 5'10", dressed in a simple gray business suit. His face seemed round with kindliness and interest in any questions which might be directed to him. Standing at his right was the taciturn Russian ambassador to the United States, Gromyko, several members of his staff, including an admiral and a major general, and a little nervous-figured translator who performed excellently in answering the few questions which were addressed to the Commissar by members of the press. Naturally, the most important question, at least the one which is tip-tongue in everyone's mind, is that of Poland and its status here at the conference. And when NBC's Richard Harkness rose after the short formal greeting by Commissar Molotov and asked, Mr. Commissar, if I may ask, what is the attitude or position of the Russian government on the Polish question, there was a slight pause. Commissar Molotov said, "Are there any more questions?" And the little laughter broke the tension. And then here is a transcript, or rather abstract, of the statement of Commissar Molotov. He said, the Polish question does not concern the conference. An excellent decision was arrived at the Crimea. Is that clear? When a little rumble in the audience indicated it was not entirely clear, the Commissar Molotov added or amplified his statement by saying that the three governments, the United States, Great Britain, and Russia, are cooperating on this important question. He says it's particularly important since Poland is our neighbor. He is sure that a solution of this somewhat vexing question will be arrived at. How can it be arrived at, asked another correspondent. He said only with the cooperation and with consultation of the Polish peoples. And therefore he suggested it might not be arrived at this conference. Then there were some more questions, one particularly about Poland's, Russia's position vis-a-vis the Argentine situation, and on that question, Commissar Molotov, with a fleet smile crossing his face, said, "That is a new question to me," and indicated by a drop of his head that no further discussion would take place of that. The whole conference took some 20 minutes, and suddenly Commissar Molotov rose and through his translator said, "We have just a few minutes before the plenary session at which I will be able to divulge more feeling on these questions," and rose and left. And so that is one of the speeches which we are expecting to hear in a few moments as this session is called to order. Standing alongside us now in the NBC box as the San Francisco Opera House fills with delegates awaiting the rap of Chairman Stettinius's gavel is the Dean of Commentators, H.V. Carltonborn. Mr. Carltonborn?
Good afternoon, everybody. I echo Ben Grauer's conclusion that the Polish question does not seem likely to find a solution here. My impression after listening to Molotov is that they have decided not to settle the matter here. Mr. Molotov emphasized the fact that it was being handled on the Crimean basis, which means, of course, that the foreign ministers themselves are handling it, and they are handling it apart from the proceedings of this conference. As you know, many extraneous issues have been brought up here, but they're being pushed aside. It looks as though the conference is really going to settle down to the task that it came here for, the building of an organization to preserve peace. And all these questions which are now at issue are not going to be permitted to intervene, either to delay the work of the conference or perhaps to create bad blood among the members because they cannot be settled. I know you want to keep us to keep you up to date on the war news. Here it is. The Red Army has just captured the prize Baltic port of Stettin. That means that the Russians are rapidly advancing down to a junction with the British, who, as you know, have already surrounded Hamburg. It is an important step in winding up the war on the Western Front. General Patton's Third Army Infantry have vaulted the Danube at 3 points along an 18-mile front on the direct route to Munich. They have stormed into the Danube fortress city of Regensburg and Ingolstadt, and his tank spearheads are now within 8 miles of Austria. The United States Fifth Army, in a whirlwind drive 21 miles north of bypassed Mantua, today captured the great city of Verona. That's the gateway city to the Po Plain. Everything indicates that German resistance has completely collapsed on the Italian front and that we are taking one city after another. There is an interesting bulletin to the effect that Benito Mussolini has been arrested, has fallen into Allied hands. It's a Swiss report. It seems quite possible Italian patriots are said to have caught him as he attempted to flee from the Allied armies and from anti-fascist risings which are now developing in northern Italy. Adolf Hitler has ousted Field Marshal Goering. That's a German report. It looks likely. Goering has had no stomach for the war for some time. He probably tried to arrange some sort of a surrender, and as a result, he's been ousted. He is said to be suffering from an acute illness, but it's that kind of diplomatic illness which may mean either that he is dead or that he has been executed by the Nazis. Here's a bulletin from Manila. The 24th Division gained another 12 miles in its eastward drive through Mindanao. It has reached a point less than 20 miles from Davao Gulf. That's General MacArthur's latest communique. American troops have pushed southward towards the important airfields in southern Okinawa today after crumbling the first major Japanese defense line, and they have now captured all the key terrain to which that defense line was anchored. That means the beginning of the end, at least, of Okinawa. Here is a dispatch from Chungking. A Tokyo Japanese language broadcast said that 100,000 Formosans have been evacuated to farms and villages on the northern part of the island in view of the emergency war situation and for the better defense of Formosa. What that probably means is that some of the natives of Formosa are getting restless, are threatening revolution, and the Japanese are taking steps to prevent that revolution. Marshal Pétain, French chief of state in the Vichy government, is still awaiting a decision by authorities concerning his entry into France. My guess is that the French government is not particularly eager to have him come back. It would be political dynamite. It would divide the French against themselves. It would place de Gaulle in an extremely difficult position because he has no desire to make a martyr out of Pétain, and yet his communist followers, the leaders of the resistance movement, are determined that Pétain must be published, and they are trying to have him executed. So it would be quite natural if the French could find some legal reason why he could not be extradited from Switzerland. The RAF's heavy bombers have again swooped down on Adolf Hitler's Berchtesgaden hideout. They demolished his mountain home, but not the underground retreat. What has been hit by these bombs is the stuff that's above the surface. But the last time I was there, they were already beginning to dig underground. And in those hills, of that particular area, it's the simplest thing in the world to establish all kinds of retreats in the mountains that cannot possibly be touched by bombing. Let me give you a little preview of what's going to happen at the official plenary session, which was supposed to open this afternoon at 4 o'clock. Then the opening was announced as for 3:30, and that's why we're filling in the time. No one has yet arrived on the podium. The delegates are practically all in their seats, but the big shots are evidently still having some final discussions before the meeting takes place. What we have this afternoon ahead of us is a speech by Secretary of State Stettinius, then a speech by the chairman of the Chinese delegation, Dr. Sung. Each of those will run perhaps 15 minutes, perhaps a little longer. And then comes what will be the most interesting speech of the afternoon, that by Foreign Commissar Molotov. Commissar Molotov told us at the press conference this afternoon, in reply to various pointed queries as to Russia's attitude on certain problems before this conference, that he would explain Russia's attitude in his address this afternoon. You will hear Molotov's voice, and we hope also to bring you an English translation of what he says. Then comes Foreign Minister Eden's first public appearance before this conference. He too has a 15-minute address, and that is the last feature that has been scheduled before adjournment. I'd like to go back now to the Molotov press conference. It seemed to me that the foreign commissar did an unusually good job in handling what was, after all, a difficult situation. There is naturally a certain amount of hostility to Russia here. Hostility for the simple reason that Russia has felt obliged to raise most of the problems which have brought about so much discussion before the Congress got underway here. Molotov, for example, was asked immediately, well, what about Poland? And the questions on Poland kept pouring in. And he, I thought, did a fairly good job in handling them. One impression that I got is that he does not believe that there ought to be any negotiations as between or with different factions of the Poles. He takes the position that we also have, well, not officially, but by implication, recognized the existence of the Lublin government now stationed at Warsaw, because it is true that in the Yalta Agreement there was absolutely no reference to the London government which we have officially recognized. And that was considered by the Russians as our admission that the London government no longer had any official standing. And so, repeatedly, when Molotov said, well, that's got to be handled with the Poles, he meant that must be handled with the Polish government established at Warsaw. He said that as far as Russia is concerned, the Russian attitude towards Poland presents no difficulties whatever, at least as far as he is concerned. He said there was a very excellent decision that was adopted at the Crimean Conference, and that decision we are going to carry out. And the three governments that were concerned in that decision are now doing all in their power to find a solution. Now, he said, I'll admit the solution is not easy. And particularly, it's not easy for us. Russia is Poland's neighbor. Now, we'll do our best to find a solution. And we'll find that solution by consulting the Poles. Now, it's not possible to settle the Polish question without the Poles. Now, the implication clearly there is that we can't settle it here in San Francisco, because it is a question that must be taken up constantly with the Polish government, which is located at Warsaw. And it was that constant emphasis on bringing in the Poles into the discussion that leads me to believe that the question is to be bypassed here, and that it will be continued, the discussion will be continued later by the three ambassadors who were appointed to handle it. Now, he was then asked, why do you ask for 3 votes in the Assembly instead of 16? After all, there are 16 separate individual Soviet Socialist republics in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Well, Molotov thought just a moment, and then quick as a flash, he came back with, we asked for a minimum. Well, that got him a big laugh. And there again, I get definitely the impression that the 3 votes are in the bag. Quite a number of delegations have already indicated that they have no objection to the 3 votes. Certainly Britain and the United States can have no objection because President Roosevelt agreed with the Russians that they were to have 3 votes in the assembly. He said this: both Ukraine and White Russia have played a very important part in the war. No one can deny, he declared, that they have certainly earned a place in the assembly. And then, very tactfully and diplomatically, he added, your great President Roosevelt admitted it, and so did Prime Minister Churchill. Now, I am confident, he added, that the attitude of the American and the British governments on this issue remains unchanged. And I want to emphasize again, he concluded, the services that were rendered by these 2 republics during the war. He was asked whether or not the Polish government would become more democratic. And for the first time I heard a Russian foreign commissar use the word democratic in an affirmative sense, because he said very definitely that he expects that the Polish government will be organized on a broader democratic basis in strict accord with the decision reached at the Crimea. And he added again, I have no doubt that all the difficulties in the way will be overcome, and that the friendly relations which now exist between Russia and Poland will continue. He was asked about Poland's representation here at the conference. Well, he said, we're naturally anxious to have Poland represented here. But he gave no indication that Russia is going to insist any further on having the Lublin Poles represented here. As I've said, I got the impression that it's transferred. And here's Ben Grauer.
While H.B. Carlton-Bourne has been talking to you, the delegates have most all of them now taken their place, and there's a riffle of applause as the chairman enters, Secretary of State Edward Stettinius.
Ladies and gentlemen, the first plenary session of the United Nations Conference on International Organization is hereby convened. The chairman of the delegation of Chile has asked permission to speak for a moment on a very special purpose. His Excellency, the Foreign Secretary of Chile. Your Excellency.
Señores delegados, la delegación de Chile ha recibido la más alta y honrosa de las misiones, representar a las repúblicas hermanas de la América Latina para solicitar de esta asamblea un homenaje a la memoria de Franklin Delano Roosevelt. La vida de un gran hombre es como la semilla de un árbol desconocido. Durante sus días terrenales vemos sus ramas y flores que pueden ser espléndidas o modestamente fragantes. El riego de la muerte suele levantarlas en esplendor y gloria y sazonar frutos de intenso sabor y belleza. Roosevelt ha sido árbol poderoso, de flores magnánimas y firmes, brotado desde el corazón de este gran pueblo y cuyo follaje se extiende sobre el mundo entero. Su muerte ha sido solo un rayo que ha destruido su forma humana. Aunque el dolor nos sobrecoja por su aparente desaparecimiento, Roosevelt vive en todas partes. Su muerte, en vez de rayo destructor, es luz de fuerte fulgor que alumbra y alumbrará cada vez más su gran labor de estadista y conductor de pueblos. Su obra espiritual empieza a agrandarse y a esparcirse en el mundo. Somos nosotros, las Naciones Unidas, los que tenemos el deber de ser fieles a esta noble herencia. Roosevelt, el humanitario, nos pide paz para la humanidad. Somos nosotros, los países de este continente, como sus hijos espirituales más directos, los que debemos llevar la herencia de sus principios a los hechos, manteniendo con firmeza su credo de buena vecindad, tanto en este continente como en el concierto de todas las naciones. Por eso, las repúblicas hermanas de América presentamos a la aprobación de la conferencia la siguiente declaración. Las repúblicas latinoamericanas invitan a todas las demás Naciones Unidas presentes en esta conferencia, como homenaje a la memoria de Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a formular el propósito de dar digno y cabal término a su obra de conductor de la democracia, de iniciador de la política de buena vecindad y de inspirador de una organización mundial para el mantenimiento de la paz por el reinado de la justicia. Me permito pedirle a la Asamblea que en señal de aprobación se ponga de pie y guarde un momento de silencio.
The delegation of Chile has received the highest honor that has been conferred, that of representing the sister republics of Latin America, to request of this assembly an homage in memory of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The life of a great man is like the seed of an unknown tree. During his days on this earth, we see its branches and flowers that may be splendid and modestly fragrant. The waters of death sometimes enhance this splendor into glory and season its fruits with an intense flavor and beauty. Roosevelt has been a powerful tree of magnanimous and firm fruits and flowers, sprung within the heart of this great people, and whose foliage extends over the entire world. His death has been only a streak of lightning that has destroyed the mere form, the mortal form. Although the sorrow that weighs upon us for his apparent disappearance, we affirm that Roosevelt goes on in all parts of the earth. His death, instead of being a destructive stroke of lightning, is a strong light that sheds its light always with greater clarity, the light of a great statesman and a great leader of peoples. His spiritual work begins to grow and to spread throughout the earth. It is we, the United Nations, who have the solemn duty to be faithful to this noble heritage. Roosevelt, the humanitarian, asks us to give humanity peace. It is we, the countries of this continent, who as his spiritual sons directly must carry this heritage, maintaining firmly his creed of good neighborliness in this continent as well as throughout the concert of nations. It is therefore fitting that the American republics present at this occasion to the conference the following declaration. The Latin American republics invite all the United Nations present in this conference to render an homage to the memory of Franklin D. Roosevelt and to hereby make the solemn purpose to give fruitful and full finishing to his work as a leader of democracy, as an initiator of the policy of good neighborliness, and as an inspirer of a world organization for the maintenance of peace through the reign of justice. I beg the Assembly to express its approval by standing and remaining silent for one moment.
May I, on behalf of the government and the people of the United States, express to you our very deep appreciation, our profound gratitude for this tribute to President Roosevelt. I know that the spirit of this great man will always be an inspiration to our united efforts, now and in the days to come, to establish and maintain lasting peace. The heads of the delegations met this morning for the purpose of recommending the organization of the conference. The meeting has not yet completed its work and will convene again tomorrow morning at 10:30. Tomorrow's plenary session that was scheduled will therefore be postponed until the afternoon. At this afternoon session, heads of the delegations, beginning with the sponsoring countries, will address the conference. At this time, I should like to make a brief statement on behalf of the United States delegation. 3 years ago, the forces of tyranny and aggression seemed on the very point of conquering the world. Today, on every front, they are face to face with defeat, utter and complete defeat. It has taken years of toil and sacrifice to bring us to this moment, but the doom of the aggressor nations was sealed long ago. It was sealed in Washington on January the 1st, 1942, when the United Nations Declaration was signed. Our enemies could conquer only by keeping us divided. Instead, we confronted them with a free and a voluntary association of nations, united in purpose and without equal in human and material resources. This unity neither force nor subterfuge had broken. Against the common will and the common strength of the United Nations, our enemies have hurled their propaganda and their armed might in vain. For centuries to come, men will point to the United Nations as history's most convincing proof of what miracles can be accomplished by nations joined together in a righteous cause. It is a unity achieved in spite of differences of language and custom, of cultural tradition, of economic structure. It is a unity which proves that no differences of race or color or creed or history or geography can divide the peoples united in a higher community of interest and purpose. Our first objective has been the defeat of our enemies. But from the beginning, the United Nations have pursued another objective. One which is equally necessary to each one of us. It is the objective which gives ultimate meaning to all the sacrifice and the suffering of these tragic years. We are united not only for survival, not only for military victory, we are united above all in the necessity to assure a just and an enduring peace to which the peoples of the world can work together to achieve at last freedom from fear and from want. We have made a better beginning toward the fulfillment of this purpose than nations have ever made before. For this purpose, the responsible leaders of our nations and their representatives have met in Moscow and in Tehran and in Cairo and Quebec, and at Dumbarton Oaks, and in the Crimea. Because of our common understanding that economic security goes hand in hand with security from war, United Nations conferences were held in Atlantic City and Hot Springs and Bretton Woods on cooperative measures for relief to meet the common problems of food and agriculture, and to prepare the financial basis for economic reconstruction and an expanding world economy in the post-war world. At Mexico City, the Inter-American Conference on Problems of War and Peace strengthened the ties between the republics of the Western Hemisphere and prepared the way for a close integration of the Inter-American system with the World Organization. Yes, the United Nations have long been at work together on many preparations required in building the structure of a lasting peace. Here at San Francisco, we have come to the decisive point in these preparations. The purpose of this conference is to prepare the charter of an international organization to maintain peace with justice in a free world of free men. I believe that it was wise and indeed a necessary decision to limit the work of this conference to that great task. It was a wise decision because writing the Constitution of a world organization for the maintenance of peace in the future is a task wholly and separate from the punishment of the international gangsters who started this war. It was a necessary decision because the establishment of the World Organization must be kept above and apart from the peace settlements if the organization is to be able to deal freely and justly with future threats to the peace that may arise from any cause, including these settlements. Preparation of the Charter of the World Organization should not therefore be entangled with the many and the complex political and economic issues involved in the defeat of Germany and Japan and the imminent collapse of organized German resistance makes it all the more important that the World Organization be established at the earliest possible moment. To deal with these and other issues, there will have to be many other conferences and many other decisions, both national and international. We have no time to lose. Success at this conference will not in itself assure enduring peace, The whole structure will take years to build. But without agreement on a charter of world organization, the structure of peace cannot be built at all. A house cannot be built without a plan or without a foundation. And here at San Francisco, the United Nations must draw the plan and lay the foundation. Upon this foundation and in accordance with this plan, the framework of the structure will be erected when the United Nations have ratified the Charter by their respective constitutional processes and brought the World Organization into being. It is only around this framework that we can complete the structure of peace with all the other agreements on political, on economic, and social problems which we must face together. At this conference, we have therefore undertaken a responsibility on which all else depends. We have undertaken to draw up the charter of an international organization strong enough to prevent war, but flexible enough to allow for peaceful development and change. The outlines of such a charter are contained in the proposals formulated at Dumbarton Oaks last fall by the representatives of the Republic of China, the Union, the Soviet Socialist Republics, and the United Kingdom and the United States. These proposals were formulated after years of preliminary study. They represent in the essentials the highest common denominator of thought among the four sponsoring nations. They are being presented to this conference as affording a basis of the charter of an international organization. The proposals were submitted months ago to the most searching examination by the governments and the peoples of all the United Nations. Since then, many constructive suggestions have been made toward their improvement. Some of these suggestions and others which may emerge from our discussions here will undoubtedly be reflected in the final draft of the Charter, and the Charter itself should be open to whatever later amendment experience may dictate as wise. We must always bear in mind, however, that there are at least two conditions essential to the establishment of a world organization which can successfully maintain peace. One of these conditions is that those peace-loving nations which have the military and the industrial strength required to prevent or suppress aggression must agree and act together against aggression. If they do not agree and act together, aggression cannot be prevented or suppressed without a major war. This fact has certainly been spelled out by our experience in this war. That is why the first step toward the establishment of the World Organization was to prepare proposals on which the nations sponsoring this conference could agree. And that is why, in the structure and the powers of the Security Council of the World Organization proposed in the Dumbarton Oaks Plan, provision was made for this essential agreement and unity of action by the major nations. Without this, we cannot hope to build a world organization which will provide security to all nations, large and small. Without this, we cannot hope to develop enduring institutions in which all free nations may participate on a basis of sovereign equality, and in which justice and respect for law will apply to the powerful as well as to the weak. The second essential condition of success in our endeavor is the voluntary cooperation of all peaceful nations, large and small, acting with full respect for the equal sovereignty of each, to promote justice among nations, to foster respect for basic human rights and to solve these common problems upon which the security and the economic and the social advancement of their peoples so largely depends. There can be no end to the tyranny of fear and want unless the proposed world organization commands the allegiance of both the mind and the conscience of mankind. The International Court, the Assembly, the Economic and the Social Council, and its related agencies are the institutions proposed at Dumbarton Oaks, which would have the major responsibility in these fields. They are of the utmost importance. Widespread economic insecurity and poverty and ignorance and oppression breed conflict and give aggressors their chance. Measures for security against aggression, no matter how effectively contrived, will not alone provide the assurance of lasting peace. We have also to work effectively in close cooperation together toward rising standards of living and greater freedom and greater opportunity for all peoples of every race and creed and color. In the preparations for this conference, we have sought from the beginning to build with vision and with justice, but to build always upon the realities and upon hard-won experience. To build upon an idealism, however fine in theory, would be to build upon quicksand. To build only on the collaboration and interests of the major nations would be to deny the community of interest of all nations. We have sought instead to assure that the strength of the major nations will be used both justly and effectively for the common welfare under the law of a world charter in which all peaceful nations are joined together. We began by seeking a common understanding among the sponsoring nations on basic objectives and on the essential machinery for action. These are the nations which have united their strength against the aggressors so successfully in this war. We proceed now in seeking agreement among all the nations, large and small, which have been united against the common enemy. This is a conference of united nations, the nations that love peace and freedom enough to fight for them. The international organization we seek to build is one that is based upon this inescapable fact of our time, that peace and security will be the right of those nations which are willing to share in the responsibility for keeping them. Tyranny and barbarism have never recognized neutrality, and they never will. We do not intend to build a world organization that will overlook this cardinal fact. We do propose that after it is established, the organization be open to membership of all other nations which have demonstrated their willingness and their ability to fulfill their obligations under the Charter. I have reviewed briefly the preparations for this conference and our thinking on some of the major problems that we must here meet together. We cannot expect at this conference to produce a charter which will answer all the questions and resolve all the problems. No charter and no constitution, no basic document was ever drafted that was not open to improvement. We Americans have a convincing proof of that in our own history. Our Constitution, under which this republic has grown and prospered for 150 years, was by no means satisfactory to all the citizens when it was issued from the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, or even satisfactory to all the delegates of that convention. It lacked many provisions which numerous Americans of that day believed to be essential. Yet it was adopted by the requisite number of states in 1789. Only 4 years after the Constitution was written, the first 10 amendments went into effect, and 11 other amendments have been made since then. What was true of the 13 states which joined to form the United States of America is true also of the nations which have met at this conference to consider the proposed organization of the world for peace and security. Let us construct the charter of the World Organization as soundly as we can, but let us not sacrifice approval to perfection. Let us not, in the sure knowledge that our work can be improved upon with time, that if we fail to act, and act now, we are likely to lose altogether the opportunity which has been given to us to prevent another world war. Fellow delegates, as we enter upon our great task, we cannot forget the millions of men of our armed forces who have given their lives in this cause, nor the other millions of men and women and children who have suffered the cruel agonies of starvation, of torture, and of death. We cannot forget the untold destruction that has been wrought, nor can we forget how close our whole civilization has come to utter ruin. It is our supreme responsibility at this conference and afterwards to see to it that this calamity never again falls upon the world. The vision we must have to see clearly that without peace and security for all nations, there will be no peace and security for any one of us. Courage we must have to carry us through trying delays and temporary misunderstandings and lesser differences to the fulfillment of our common purpose. And faith we must have in the ability of mankind to make peace with the same resolute devotion that the United Nations peoples have given to fighting this war. That vision and that courage and that faith inspired the great American leader whose life was given for the cause for which we have met, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It is only with such vision and courage and faith expressed in 1,000 different ways that the United Nations have been able to travel so far along the hard road to final victory. It is only with this vision and this courage and this faith that we shall make peace secure for ourselves and for succeeding generations. I thank you.
You have heard the address by Secretary of State Edward Stettinius at the first plenary session of the United Nations Conference.
Delegation of the United Kingdom, who speaks first? Ladies and gentlemen, I now recognize His Excellency, the Foreign Minister of the Republic of China and Chairman of the Delegation of the Republic of China, Dr. T.V. Soong.
Dr. Soong, a tall figure in formal black dress, and now here is Dr. Soong.
fellow delegates, I wish, first of all, to speak of China's regard for the memory of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And I do this with deep emotion. To us, he was not only the first citizen of the United States, but also the inspired leader of the world, passionately devoted to the cause of peace and justice among nations. His vision and faith, his statesmanship and courage have brought the victory of the United States within sight, United Nations within sight. He embodied the ideals and hopes of the peoples everywhere. He was rightly regarded as the leading proponent and architect of a durable system of peace, which was to crown our joint efforts in the present struggle. Only a fortnight ago, he was still actively guiding the work of preparation for this great conference. Although he has left us, his work will continue to guide us. In tribute to his memory and in recognition of all that he has done for us, let us concert our efforts and complete the important task ahead in the fullest measure. China, perhaps more than any other nation, understands the necessity for the success of this conference. For it is now universally recognized that the Second World War had started when the Japanese invaded Manchuria in 1931, thus depriving China of 30 million of her people and of the rich natural resources so essential to her national existence. Twice in our generation, it has been necessary to mobilize the world's resources of men and material to arrest tyranny and preserve freedom. Twice in our generation, we have had to learn by bitter experience that in an interdependent world, war cannot be localized or peace isolated. Twice in our generation, we have lost lives in tragic numbers and treasure in prodigious volume that could have been saved if peace-loving nations had united when peace was first threatened, instead of waiting until aggression had engulfed half the world in flames. In the 14 years of savage warfare since 1931, China has endured every misery that the aggression of a major predatory power can impose. We sought by all means which were then available in the existing state of international organization to obtain redress. Inescapably, we learned that there was no hope of ultimate safety for any nation without a really effective system of collective security. Therefore, at the very inception of the idea of the United Nations, President Chiang Kai-shek advocated the early setting up of an Executive Council of the United Nations, since without such an authority, a world order cannot function. Let us face hard facts. A long effort is required of all of us before an effective rule of law is established in world affairs. We in China know it by bitter experience. The rule of law was to have been defended by the old League of Nations, but it was disregarded, as we learned to our cost, despite the most solemn covenants entered into by would-be defaulters. Why did collective security under the League finally fail to the point that none of the belligerents who were permanent members of the League's Council invoked the covenant at the outbreak of this terrible war? Because much of the real power in the world was not present in the League. The United States was not a member. The Soviet Union's voice was not always heeded, and China was only occasionally represented on its council, while Japan, Italy, and Germany were allowed simply to resign after committing acts of aggression with complete impunity. Today it is different. Today, victory is the result of the cumulative efforts of collective security in action. Germany and Japan are to be kept powerless to do harm. The United States and the Soviet Union are now among the chief artisans of the new international order, and their overwhelming strength will be joined with that of the other powers to back it. Its authority will be upheld by all the powerful nations of our day. To ensure the fulfillment of our aims for effective international organization, we must lose no time. We must not leave this conference without having arranged for the setting up of a new international organization. The Council will have to deal with security arrangements as varied as the requirements of the situations to be met. There will be problems of what security forces are to be maintained, of manpower, of industrial organization, of military equipment, of security bases under the aegis of the United Nations, and also vital problems of economic recovery and development, on which the life of every nation depends. If there is any message that my country, which has been one of the principal victims of aggression and the earliest victim, wishes to give to this conference, it is that we must not hesitate to delegate a part of our sovereignty to the new international organization in the interest of collective security. We must all be ready to make some sacrifices in order to achieve our common purpose. Among nations, no less than among individuals, we must forthwith accept the concept of liberty under law. We of the Chinese delegation come from a part of the world with teeming populations, whom the cataclysm of this war has stirred to the very depths of their souls. They have witnessed the rise and fall of mighty empires. They have gauged by the precepts of their own philosophies the depth of villainies perpetrated by the exponents of brute force. And they have appreciated fully the majestic surge of the power of free men joined in comradeship. And they now strive ardently to attain the common goal of human liberty within a commonwealth of free peoples.
The Minister for Foreign Affairs of China has just concluded his speech, TV Sung. He shakes hands with Chairman Stettinius. with the applause of the delegates here assembled in the San Francisco Opera House at the United Nations Conference. Here is Mr. Stettinius.
The chair now recognizes His Excellency, Mr. V.M. Molotov, People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs and Chairman of the Delegation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics.
Commissar Molotov rises from his place in the group of delegate seats, walks slowly forward, shakes hands with Mr. Stettinius, a sheaf of manuscript in his hand. The applause renews and increases. And here is the People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs of Russia.
Господин председатель, господа, по поручению правительства Союза Советских Социалистических Республик я в первых же словах советской делегации на настоящей исторической конференции хотел бы выразить правительству Соединенных Штатов Америки и лично государственному секретарю господину Стеттиниусу глубокую признательность за всю огромную подготовительную работу, проведенную перед настоящей конференцией, и за образцовую организацию Конференции Объединенных Наций. Одновременно я пользуюсь возможностью от имени советской делегации высказать самую искреннюю благодарность мэру города Сан-Франциско господину Лафам за сердечное гостеприимство, оказанное делегацией в Сан-Франциско. Господа, советское правительство придает важное значение международной конференции в Сан-Франциско. Приблизился конец войны, по крайней мере в Европе. Разгром гитлеровской Германии, главного агрессора в этой войне, стал фактом. Пришла пора позаботиться о послевоенном времени, о будущем. Конференция должна рассмотреть вопрос о создании организации по защите всеобщего мира
This
и
is the
безопасности
NBC booth.
народа.
May we intrude for just a moment to remind our listeners that immediately following the speech of Commissar Molotov, which is now going on in Russian, a full translation will be given by the official translator to the delegates here and to NBC listeners. That will occur in approximately 12 minutes at the end of the Commissar's speech.
В случаях мы снова должны вспомнить великое имя президента Франклина Делано Рузвельта, его заслуги в деле борьбы за завоевание прочного мира и в подготовке настоящей конференции получили широчайшее признание среди всех миролюбивых народов. Вторая мировая война намного превзошла Первую мировую войну по размаху военных действий и по размерам участвующих армий, по количеству людских жертв по неисчислимым разрушениям, по своим неслыханно жестоким последствиям для жизни многих народов. Развязавшая эту войну гитлеровская Германия не останавливалась ни перед какими последствиями для жизни многих народов. Не останавливалась ни перед какими преступлениями, чтобы навязать свое господство в Европе и проложить путь к мировому господству германского империализма. Массовые убийства детей, женщин и стариков, истребление целых национальностей, поголовное уничтожение неугодных фашистам мирных жителей, варварское уничтожение культуры и непокорных культурных деятелей, разрушение многих тысяч городов и сел, крушение хозяйственной жизни целых народов и неисчислимые потери. Обо всем этом нельзя забыть. В свое время германский фашизм не только открыто готовил свои армии и вооружения для разбойничьего нападения на мирные народы. Гитлеризм без стеснения приспособлял также идеологии многих миллионов людей в своей стране к целям завоевания господства над другими народами. Этому служили и безграмотные, человеконенавистнические теории о немецкой расе господ, в услужении у которой должны якобы находиться другие народы. Еще задолго до прямого нападения на своих соседей гитлеризм у всех на глазах подготовлял преступную войну, которую он развязал тогда, когда захотел. Как известно, у него нашлись и бесчестные приспешники, и кровавые соучастники. Известно также, что, вторгшись в Советский Союз, немецкий фашизм, свободно гулявший до того по всей Европе, встретился с непреклонным противником. Советская страна, спасшая европейскую цивилизацию в кровавых битвах с немецким фашизмом, с полным основанием напоминает сейчас об ответственности правительств за будущее миролюбивых народов после окончания этой войны. Это тем более необходимо сделать, что перед нынешней войной предостерегающий голос Советской Республики не был выслушан с должным вниманием. Сейчас не время подробно вдаваться в причины этого. Нельзя доказать, что не было желания помешать возникновению войны. Полностью, однако, доказано, что правительства, претендовавшие в свое время на руководящую роль в Европе, показали, если не свое нежелание, то свою неспособность предотвратить войну, с последствиями которой будет еще не так легко справиться. Конференция должна заложить основы организации будущей безопасности народов. Это великая задача, которую до сего времени не удавалось успешно решить. Кому неизвестно, что Лига наций ни в какой мере не справилась с этим делом. Она обманула надежды тех, кто в нее верил. Понятно, что теперь никто не хочет восстанавливать бесправную и бессильную Лигу наций, не мешавшую любому агрессору готовить войну против миролюбивых стран, а иногда и прямо усыплявшую бдительность народов в отношении надвигавшейся агрессии. Особенно авторитет Лиги наций подрывался тогда, когда ее без стеснения старались превратить в орудие тех или иных реакционных сил и привилегированных держав. Если здесь приходится напоминать о печальных уроках Лиги наций, то именно для того, чтобы в будущем избежать старых ошибок, которых не следует допускать, и под вывеской новых пышных обещаний. Нельзя, однако, рассчитывать на бесконечное терпение народов, если снова обнаружится неспособность правительств создать международную организацию, ограждающую мирную жизнь людей, их семьи, их молодые поколения от ужасов и бедствий новых разбойничьих империалистических войн. Советское правительство является искренним и твердым сторонником создания сильной международной организации безопасности. Все, что будет зависеть от него самого и от его усилий в общем деле, создание такой послевоенной организации мира и безопасности народов будет с готовностью сделано советским правительством. Мы будем полностью сотрудничать в решении этой великой задачи со всеми другими правительствами, действительно преданными этому благородному делу. Мы уверены в том, что эта историческая цель будет достигнута совместными усилиями миролюбивых народов, несмотря на все препятствия, стоящие на пути ее осуществления. Большим вкладом в это дело является известная всем нам работа, выполненная в прошлом году в Думбартон-Оксе. Представители Соединенных Штатов Америки, Великобритании, Китая и Советского Союза выработали там такие основы международной организации безопасности, которые кладут важное начало международной организации нового типа. Совсем недавно, по предложению великого американского президента Франклина Рузвельта, на Крымской конференции были приняты важные дополнения к этому проекту. Настоящая конференция, благодаря всему этому, имеет твердую почву для своей успешной деятельности. Вполне естественно, что новая организация международной безопасности строится на том фундаменте, который был заложен Объединенными Нациями в этой войне. Известно, что в Европе в тяжелой борьбе с общим врагом сложилась великая коалиция демократических держав. Благодаря созданию англо-советско-американской коалиции был обеспечен разгром германского фашизма и его приспешников. Во главе с этой великой коалицией вели и ведут борьбу за свое освобождение и другие народы Европы. Коалиция великих держав с их непреклонной волей в защите своих национальных прав, а также интересов освобождения всех других народов, ставших жертвой кровавой агрессии, завершает выполнение задачи разгрома врага всех Объединенных Наций. Она могла это сделать как в силу сознания своей исторической ответственности, так и благодаря тем огромным людским и материальным ресурсам, которыми она обладает и которые неуклонно получали то направление, которого требовали интересы борьбы с общим врагом. Но мы всегда должны помнить, что нажитый авторитет нетрудно растранжирить. если забыть о некоторых элементарных вещах. Например, если забыть об уроках Лиги наций, или если забыть об уроках этой войны, в которой демократические нации объединились против империалистической державы, возомнившей себя хозяином Европы и захотевшей навязывать свою волю чуть ли не всему миру. Эта коалиция выкована в огне борьбы и уже сослужила великую службу делу Объединенных Наций. Нельзя не признать, что наличие в составе этой коалиции такой страны, как Советский Союз, где решение вопроса о взаимоотношениях между большими и малыми народами последовательно осуществлено на основе равноправия и подлинного демократизма, имеет исключительно важное принципиальное значение. Нельзя переоценить и факт активного участия в этой коалиции Соединенных Штатов Америки, раньше стоявших в стороне от вопросов международной организации, а теперь вкладывающих в это дело свою инициативу и громадный международный авторитет. Эта коалиция была бы просто невозможна без Великобритании, которой принадлежит выдающаяся роль в международном объединении демократических стран. Китай в Азии и Франция в Европе являются теми великими странами, которые укрепляют эту коалицию как могучую мировую силу, также и на послевоенное время. Если ведущие демократические страны покажут свою способность согласованно действовать и в послевоенное время, это будет значить, что интересы мира и безопасности народов нашли, наконец, свою лучшую опору и защиту. Но этого еще недостаточно. Готовы ли другие миролюбивые страны объединиться вокруг этих ведущих держав, чтобы создать дееспособную международную организацию безопасности? Вот тот вопрос, который должен быть разрешен на настоящей конференции в интересах будущего мира и безопасности народов. Дело идет о создании международной организации, которой должны быть предоставлены определенные права по охране интересов всеобщего мира. Такая организация должна иметь и некоторые необходимые средства военной защиты безопасности народов. Только при наличии таких предпосылок, когда нарушение мира или угроза такого нарушения не будет безнаказанной и проведение соответствующих мер наказания не будет слишком запоздалым, Организация безопасности сможет нести ответственность за дело мира. Таким образом, дело о создании дееспособной организации по защите всеобщего мира и безопасности народов, о которой давно мечтают все искренние сторонники мирного развития народов, но у которой всегда было много непримиримых врагов в лагере наиболее агрессивных империалистов. После неисчислимых жертв этой войны, после пережитых в эти годы страданий и бедствий, особенно велико стремление народов к созданию такой организации. но не сложили оружие и противники создания подобной международной организации. Они и теперь ведут свою подрывную работу, хотя в большинстве случаев делает это в скрытой, завуалированной форме. Для этого нередко используются по внешности самые демократические лозунги и аргументы, вплоть до словесной защиты интересов малых наций или принципов справедливости и равноправия народов. Но в конце концов не то важно, по каким мотивам или под каким предлогом будет сорвано создание дееспособной организации безопасности народов. Если и на этот раз не будет создана такая эффективная организация по защите послевоенного мира, то это явится еще одним показателем неспособности справиться данными силами с этой великой задачей. Но это не будет доказательством, что необходимость в такой организации еще не созрела, и что такая организация не будет создана в дальнейшем. Мы не должны преуменьшать трудностей создания международной организации безопасности. С закрытыми глазами мы здесь не найдем дороги. Мы должны предупреждать об этих трудностях, чтобы преодолеть их и, избежав иллюзий, найти, наконец, надежный путь для движения вперед к достижению этой благородной цели. При этом я хотел бы заверить конференцию в отношении Советского Союза, что в нашей стране весь народ воспитывается в духе веры и преданности делу создания прочной организации международной безопасности. Я хотел бы также заверить конференцию, что советские люди будут чутко прислушиваться к голосу, к пожеланиям и предложениям всех искренних друзей этого великого дела среди народов всего мира. Вы знаете, что в Советском Союзе есть миллионы людей, которые умеют с оружием в руках до конца постоять за свою родину. Вместе с тем, именно в нашей советской стране народ всей душой предан делу создания прочного всеобщего мира и готов всеми силами поддержать усилия других наций в создании надежной организации мира и безопасности народов. Вы определенно должны знать, что в деле защиты мира и безопасности народов на Советский Союз можно положиться. Об этом говорит политика советского правительства, наша Красная Армия и наш великий маршал Сталин. Выразить эти чувства и мысли советских людей является важнейшей задачей делегации советского правительства. Я заканчиваю свое выступление горячим пожеланием наших общих успехов в работе настоящей конференции.
Foreign Commissar Molotov has concluded his speech, shakes hands with Secretary Stettinius, and in a moment we will have the official translation by the translator who has been making notes of any changes from the prepared text, the translation in English.
In English by Mr. Pavlov.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, on instructions of the government of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, I should like, at the very beginning of my speech that I am making on behalf of the Soviet delegation at this historic conference, to express my deep gratitude to the government of the United States of America and to Secretary of State Mr. Stettinius personally for the immense amount of work of preparation carried out by them prior to this conference, and also for the excellent organization of the Conference of the United Nations. At the same time, I should like to seize this opportunity to express on behalf of the Soviet delegation my most sincere gratitude to Mr. Lapham, Mayor of San Francisco, for the cordial hospitality extended to my delegation in San Francisco. Ladies and gentlemen, the Soviet government attaches a great importance to the International Conference in San Francisco. The end of the war has drawn near, at least in Europe. The rout of Hitler Germany, the principal aggressor in this war, has become a fact. The time has come to take care of the post-war period of the future. This conference is called upon to consider the question of setting up an organization to protect the general peace and security of nations after the war. This clearly shows how great is the responsibility resting upon this conference. Today, as well as on many other occasions, we must remember the great name of President Franklin Roosevelt. His services in the struggle for the achievement of a lasting peace and in the preparation of this historic conference have met with a wide recognition among all the peace-loving nations. The Second World War by far exceeded the First World War in the magnitude of military operations and the size of the armies involved, and in lives lost, as well as in the unusually severe consequences for the life of many peoples. Hitler Germany, which started this war, did not shrink from any crimes in trying to impose her domination on Europe and to pave the way to the world domination of German imperialism. Mass murders of children, women, and old men, the extermination of nations in their entirety, the wholesale destructions of peaceful citizens who were not to the liking of fascists, the barbaric destruction of culture and of unruly men prominent in culture, and the destruction of many thousands of towns and villages, the dislocation of economic life of nations, and incalculable losses, all these cannot be forgotten. In the past, German fascism not only openly prepared its armies and armaments for a piratic attack on peaceful countries, but Hitlerism cynically adjusted the ideology of many millions of people in its country to the purposes of achieving domination over foreign nations. This purpose was also served by the illiterate misanthropic theories on the German master race, in whose service foreign nations were supposed to be. Long before the direct attack on its neighbors, Hitlerism openly prepared for a criminal war which it started at a moment of its own choosing. As it is well known, Hitlerism found unscrupulous henchmen and sanguinary accomplices. It is also well known that when German fascism, which had made an easy tour of all Europe, invaded the Soviet Union, it faced an unflinching adversary. The country of Soviets, which has saved the European civilization in bloody battles with German fascism, with good reason reminds now the governments of their responsibility for the future of peace-loving nations after the termination of this war. This is all the more necessary to do that before this war, the warning voice of the Soviet Republic was not heard with due attention. This is no time to explain at length why this happened. It cannot be proved that there was no desire to prevent the war. It has been fully proved, however, that the governments which claimed once the leading part in Europe manifested their inability, if not reluctance, to prevent the war, with the consequences of which it will be not so easy to cope with. The conference is called upon to lay the foundations of the future security of nations. This is a great problem which it has been thus far impossible to solve successfully. Anybody knows that the League of Nations in no way coped with this problem. It betrayed the hopes of those who believed in it. It is obvious that no one wishes to restore the League of Nations with no rights and powers which did not interfere with any aggressor preparing for war against peace-loving nations, and which sometimes even lulled outright the nation's vigilance with regard to impending aggression. The prestige of the League of Nations was especially undermined whenever unceremonious attempts were made to turn it into a tool of various reactionary forces and privileged powers. If the said lessons of the League of Nations have to be mentioned now, it is only in order that past errors may be avoided, which must not be committed under the sign of new profuse promises. It is impossible, however, to count indefinitely on the patience of nations if the governments manifest their inability to set up an international organization protecting the peaceful life of peoples, their families, their young generations against the horrors and hardships of new piratic imperialist wars. The Soviet government are a sincere and a firm champion of the establishment of a strong international organization of security, whatever may depend upon them and their efforts in their common cause of the creation of such a post-war organization of peace and security of nations will be readily done by the Soviet government. We will fully cooperate in the solution of this great problem with all the other governments genuinely devoted to this noble cause. We are confident that this historic aim will be achieved by joint efforts of peace-loving nations in spite of all the obstacles in the way of its achievement. The work which was carried out at Dumbarton Oaks last year and which is well known to all of us is an important contribution to this cause. Representatives of the United States of America, Great Britain, China, and the Soviet Union worked out there such principles of the International Security Organization as will constitute an important basis for the international organization of a new type. Quite recently, at the suggestion of the late great President Franklin Roosevelt, the Crimean Conference made important supplements to this draft. As a result, this conference has a sound basis for successful work. Naturally, that the new organization of international security will be built upon on the foundation laid by the United Nations in this war. It is well known that in Europe, in the strenuous struggle against the common enemy, a great coalition of democratic powers was formed. The formation of the Anglo-Soviet American coalition ensured the rout of German fascism and its henchmen. The other nations of Europe, led by this coalition, have been fighting for their liberation. The coalition of great powers, with their inflexible will to defend their national interest and to promote the liberation of all the other nations which fell victim to sanguinary aggression, is consummating the task of defeating the enemy of all the United Nations. This coalition could accomplish it because it was conscious of its historic mission and because it possessed immense manpower and material resources which were invariably used in the interest of the struggle against the enemy. But we must always bear in mind that prestige acquired is easily wasted. If we forget certain elementary things, such as the lessons of the League of Nations, or the lessons of this war in which the democratic nations rallied against an imperialist power which considered itself master of Europe and which intended to impose its will well nigh on the whole world. This coalition was forged in the fire of struggle and rendered a great service to the cause of the United Nations. It must be admitted that the presence in this coalition of such a country as the Soviet Union, where relations between great and small nations are based on equality and true democracy, is of extremely great importance. On the other hand, it is impossible to overrate the active part played in this coalition by the United States of America, which formerly remained aloof from the problems of international organization and which is now devoting to this cause its initiative and enormous international prestige. This coalition would have been merely impossible without Great Britain, which holds an important place in the International Association of Democratic Countries. China in Asia and France in Europe are the great nations which strengthen this coalition as a powerful world factor in the post-war period as well. If the leading democratic countries show their ability to act in harmony in the post-war period as well, that will mean that the interests of peace and security of nations have received at last a firm basis and protection. But that is not all. The point at issue is whether other peace-loving nations are willing to rally around these leading powers to create an effective international security organization, and this has to be settled at this conference in the interests of the future peace and security of nations. An international organization must be created, having certain powers to safeguard the interests of the general peace. This organization must have the necessary means for military protection of the security of nations. Only if conditions are created such as will guarantee that no violation of the peace or the threat of such a violation shall go unpunished, and the adoption of necessary punitive measures is not too late, will the organization of security be able to discharge its responsibility for the cause of peace. Thus, the point at issue is the creation of an effective organization to protect the general peace and security of nations, for which all the sincere partisans of the peaceful development of nations have long been earning, but which has always had numerous irreconcilable enemies in the camp of the most aggressive imperialists. After innumerable sacrifices borne in this war, and after sufferings and hardships experienced in these past years, the urge of nations for the establishment of such an organization is especially strong. The opponents of the creation of such an international organization have not laid down their arms. They are carrying on their subversive activities even now, though in most cases they are doing it in a latent and veiled form. For this purpose, they frequently use ostensibly the most democratic watchwords and arguments, including the professed protection of the interest of small nations or of the principles of the equity and equality of nations. But in the end, it is not important what reasons or pretexts have been used to disrupt the establishment of an effective organization of the security of nations. If even now no such an effective organization is created to protect the post-war peace, this will be another indication of the inability to cope with this great problem by means of the forces available. But that will not prove that the necessity for such an organization has not yet arisen, and that such an organization will not be set up ultimately. We must not minimize the difficulties involved in the establishment of the International Security Organization. With our eyes closed, we shall not be able to find the road. We must warn of these difficulties in order to overcome them and, avoiding illusions, to find at last a reliable road to march along towards the achievement of this noble objective. As far as the Soviet Union is concerned, I should like to assure the conference at this time that in our country the whole people are brought up in the spirit of faith in and devotion to the cause of setting up a solid organization of international security. I should like also to assure the conference that the Soviet people will readily heed the voice, wishes, and suggestions of all the sincere friends of this great cause among the nations of the world. You know that there are millions of people in the Soviet Union who know how to defend to the last, with arms in hand, their motherland. At the same time, it is especially in our country of Soviets that the people are devoted with all their hearts to the cause of the establishment of a durable general peace and are willing to support with all their forces the efforts of other nations to create a reliable organization of peace and security. I wish you to know that the Soviet Union can be relied upon in the matter of safeguarding the peace and security of nations. Our peaceful people, the Soviet government, the Red Army, and our great Marshal Stalin are inflexibly supporting this great cause. It is the most important task of the delegation of the Soviet government to express these sentiments and thoughts of the Soviet people. I conclude my speech by expressing my heartfelt wishes for our joint success in the work of the conference.
Monsieur le Président, Mesdames, Messieurs, chargé par le gouvernement de l'Union des républiques soviétiques socialistes, je voudrais, par les premières paroles...
We have here now a translation into French of the remarks of Commissar Molotov.
Exprimer au gouvernement des États-Unis et au secrétaire d'État, M. Stettinius, personnellement, notre profonde reconnaissance pour l'immense travail accompli par eux pour préparer la présente conférence et aussi pour...
May I interrupt just one moment to say after that Mr. Molotov's speech is translated into French, Mr. Anthony Eden will speak.
En même temps, je veux saisir cette occasion pour exprimer, au nom de la délégation soviétique, nos sincères remerciements au maire de la ville de San Francisco, M. Lafame, pour sa hospitalité cordiale envers la délégation à San Francisco. Mesdames et Messieurs, le gouvernement soviétique attache une grande importance à la conférence internationale à San Francisco. La fin de la guerre est proche, tout au moins en Europe. La défaite de l'Allemagne hitlérienne, agresseur principal au cours de cette guerre, est un fait acquis. Il est temps de prendre soin de la période d'après-guerre de l'avenir. La conférence doit examiner la question de la création d'une organisation pour protéger la paix universelle et la sécurité des peuples après la guerre. Cela montre à quel point...
Ladies and gentlemen, we're speaking to you now from the NBC booth while the translation into French of the remarks of Commissar Molotov is given to the delegates at the United Nations Conference. Since it has been delivered both in its original language of Russian and in English translation, we feel you will be interested now in some comments by our corps of observers at the scene. Here first is H.V. Kaltenborn.
Good afternoon, everybody. We've had 3 speeches so far, one by Secretary of State Stettinius, one by Chairman of the Chinese delegation, Dr. T.V. Sung, and one by Foreign Commissar Molotov. Let me give you just a few words about each one of these 3 speeches. Mr. Stettinius pointed out and emphasized several times the fact that the world organization must be kept above and apart from the peace settlements. He said this was absolutely essential if the organization to be formed here in San Francisco is to be able to deal freely and justly with future threats to the peace that may arise from any cause, including those settlements. In other words, Mr. Stettinius realistically looks forward to the fact that after a great war like this, there are many settlements. Some of them are sound, some of them are unsound, some have to be corrected. And as a result, the unsound settlements and the necessity for correction naturally create difficulties. And his purpose is to keep this peace organization that we're going to build here apart from those peace settlements. You remember that is exactly what was not done at Versailles. There, the League and the treaty were inextricably intertwined, and as a result, there was trouble from the beginning. The League became the executant of the peace treaty, and that was one of the great reasons why the League failed. So we have learned that much from experience. Success at this conference, Mr. Stettinius points out, will not of itself assure enduring peace. The whole structure will take years to build. But, he said, without agreement on a charter, the structure of peace can't be built at all. And he pointed out that what we're doing here is to develop the plan and the foundation. And so, he said, the first step required cooperation of the big powers. That is a thing that also was emphasized several times by Molotov, that it was the essential agreement and unity of action by the major nations that was the fundamental basis for any kind of progress here. Without this, he said, we cannot hope to build a world organization which will provide security for all nations. Dr. Soon pointed out that the Second World War started when the Japanese invaded Manchuria in 1931. That's a fact that cannot be sufficiently repeated, because it is that failure to enforce the agreements made in the League of Nations Covenant in 1931, that failure that resulted in the developments, the bringing of Hitler, and the coming of the Second World War. We must all, he said, be ready to make sacrifices to achieve our purpose, and that reference to sacrifices was applauded, particularly by the delegates of the small nations. Coming now to Commissar Molotov, he began, like other speakers, with his tribute to Franklin D. Roosevelt. I was interested to see that he uses the term fascism as a collective term. He does not specifically differentiate Nazism, a word he never uses. He pointed out that the Soviet Union saved Europe from fascism, emphasizing the part played by Russia in the war. And he also said very truthfully that the warning voice of the Soviet Union was not heard. Myself, I have repeatedly heard Commissar Litvinov, then the foreign commissar of the Soviet Union, speaking loudly at Geneva against the dangerous developments in Germany, and Mr. Molotov is wise to remind us that Litvinov's voice at that time was ignored. He cited the important role played by the United States today and reminded us that we formerly remained aloof. He pointed that the new league was impossible without the cooperation of Britain. He referred to China and the role she plays in Asia, and then made a friendly reference to France in Europe, which also strengthens the organization. And of course the French will be thrilled beyond belief at the fact that French is recognized as one of the official languages of the conference by the fact that Molotov's speech is being translated into French. I venture to suggest that that is a friendly gesture which was made towards France at the instance of the Russians themselves. Russia, of course, has always had French as its second language. Mr. Molotov points out that we must have, to be successful, the necessary means for military protection, that punitive measures must be prompt, that the opponents of peace sometimes use democratic watchwords, and this was an indication that some people, from his point of view, who claim to speak in the interest of small nations, like Poland, although he didn't mention the word Poland, that they actually are opponents of peace and are using these watchwords of democracy and small nations in order to oppose the general peace purpose. And he says that they are enemies of our Union. He closed by asking us not to underestimate the difficulties and said that the Russian people have been brought up to be believers in the principle of international security and pledged that the Soviet Union can be relied upon to support the cause of peace. Now here is Ben Grauer.
H.V. Kaltenborn has given you his comments on the principal speakers who have been heard at this session of the United Nations Conference. At this moment, the translation of Commissar Molotov's remarks into French for the benefit of the delegates is still continuing. Here alongside me is NBC's observer, particularly of the Washington scene, who's joined us here in San Francisco, Richard Harkness.
Good afternoon, everyone. Well, here in San Francisco today, we have seen the United Nations Security Council make real progress. It may be negative progress, but after the address by Foreign Commissar Molotov of Russia, after the address of Secretary of State Stettinius, it appears now that the problem of Poland is no longer an immediate stumbling block to setting up a world organization for security. It seems plain now that the United Nations Big Four will put aside the very thorny, delicate question of Poland until after this conference here in San Francisco. And having put that question aside, they will go ahead now and set up a world peace organization within the frameworks of Dumbarton Oaks. So after the first day of doubt, after a day of bewilderment as to whether the Big Four would be able to come to any agreement at all, delegates are much more optimistic this afternoon. Now, if the Polish question is delayed, as it looks now, the agreement to the postponement was obviously made at that Big Four meeting yesterday. That was when Mr. Stettinius, our Secretary of State, Commissar Molotov, Anthony Eden, the Foreign Secretary of Great Britain, and Mr. T.V. Sung, speaking for China, held their last meeting, a meeting just a little while before this United Nations conference formally convened yesterday afternoon. Well, the report then was that these gentlemen, the spokesmen, the representatives of the Big Four, were deadlocked still over Poland. That is true, no doubt, since no agreement is in sight even now. But there was that agreement today to delay the settlement until after Dumbarton Oaks has been developed into a real-world organization. Now, until this new agreement reached yesterday, Mr. Molotov and members of the Russian delegation had refused even to say good morning to newsmen out here in San Francisco. Every place Molotov went, he was preceded by a flying wedge which took him through newsmen, just as a flying wedge on a football field takes the ball carrier through the opposing line. But today, after staying away from newsmen, the Russian Commissar for Foreign Affairs called a news conference, and he met for half an hour or more with some 450 of us who are here in San Francisco. In effect, from what he said, Molotov announced this delay in trying to settle the problem of Poland. He said that he was very anxious for Poland to be represented here in San Francisco, and he added, and here's a line, that it is not possible to solve the Polish issue without the Poles themselves. Now, that was the first step on the agreement to put off this delicate question. And then at the full conference session this afternoon, Secretary of State Stettinius made the opening address. That's the address you heard over this NBC network. And he supported the position of Mr. Molotov for delaying the Polish problem. Now, this indication that the question of Poland will not be permitted to upset the conference came as good news to delegates from our 46 United Nations. And it is fair to report, I'm sure, that an entirely new atmosphere, an atmosphere of optimism, now prevails here in the Grand Opera House at San Francisco. And that new atmosphere of optimism is slightly different than the air of bewilderment and wondering which was so prevalent here yesterday. Now, it is plain at the same time that the Russian delegation, and Molotov particularly, are ready to press for 3 votes for Russia. I think there is no doubt that that will be one of the next important decisions of the conference, giving 3 votes for Russia. And so no difficulty is expected on that point. Now, this will mean a vote for Russia, a vote for White Russia, and a vote for the Ukraine. Now, there's a report this afternoon, one which cannot be confirmed as yet, that delegations from White Russia and a delegation from the Ukraine are here in San Francisco already. In other words, Russia was so confident of winning on this question of 3 votes that these 2 delegations came on to San Francisco and have been, as we say it here in America, keeping undercover. Now, here again is Ben Grauer.
Thanks very much, Dick Harkness. We've been in a little difficulties here with our consultations just a few inches off mic while you've been talking. Alex Dreyer who has come on from Chicago for the San Francisco conference, has some words with us while we watch to see when the conclusion of the French translation occurs so that we can continue with the business of the conference from the actual platform. Here is Alex Dreyer.
Good afternoon, everybody. Though the discussions here in San Francisco are primarily concerned with the establishment of a peace machinery, and so the maintenance of a peace which is yet to be won, obviously there are still scattered all over the globe the forces of justice designed to break the back of the fascist Jap aggressor. And as this conference gets underway here in San Francisco, there is every indication that the imminent collapse of German resistance is at hand. Foreign Commissar Molotov expressed that belief at his press conference this afternoon, and Secretary of State Stettinius amplified the belief with the comment that no time must be lost here in San Francisco in the effort to establish the machinery of peace. While delegates from 46 nations, representing over 1 billion human beings, talk of the problems of peace, men all over the world are still dying, still shedding their blood. And even though in a remote sort of way, their eyes are focused upon this important gathering in San Francisco, their task is the larger task of the immediate present, and they are fulfilling that task well. From Europe's Western Front this afternoon comes word that General Patton's Third Army has vaulted the Danube and rolled within sight of Austria. That's on a direct route to the German stronghold in the heart of the Alpine zone. Patton's infantrymen crossed the Danube at 4 points along an 18-mile front and stormed into the Danube fortress cities of Regensburg and Ingolstadt, and that at a time when his racing tanks were reported to be within 8 miles of Austria. It is becoming increasingly obvious that Nazi resistance at this stage will tend to stiffen as the threat to the Nazi redoubt increases. The fascist rodents have nothing to lose, everything to gain. And even though organized German resistance, in a wide sense of the term, is disintegrating, the basic Nazi boast that the Nazis intend to hold out to the last German still stands. But we are willing to wager that that last German will not answer to the name of Adolf. On the North Sea coast, Bremen, now a rubbled, fire-gutted city, has already fallen to the British, and the Russians have taken Stettin. These are the more immediate signs of what is happening and why there is so much confusion in the German ranks. There is no longer a functioning command in Berlin. That citadel of evil is about to go through a complete process of fumigation. The American-Russian junction south of the citadel is imminent and probably will occur with the fall of all of Berlin. With the names of cities disappearing in the news, there is also the disappearance of names, in the sense that the bearers of those names are vanishing as quickly as the cities. Goering is reported to have suffered a heart attack. That's the Nazi version. It probably means that he has been disposed of. Goering has had little appetite for this war for some time. A negotiated peace long ago probably would have been to his liking. In northern Italy, the sawdust Caesar Mussolini has been captured by Italian partisans. And so the evil father of European fascism, who stabbed France in the back, who hoped thereby to ride the crest of a German wave into Britain, nears his physical end as well. And that's the war, and now back to Ben Grauer.
Immediately to the platform and Secretary Stettinius.
Ladies and gentlemen, the chair now recognizes the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, the chairman of the delegation of the United Kingdom, Mr. Anthony Eden.
Anthony Eden, Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs of the United Kingdom, easily the most distinguished to our popular knowledge figure in the conference, is striding to the platform. He, as the other principal speakers, shakes hands with Secretary Stettinius. Gallant figure. He's taking his glasses out to adjust them, and here is Secretary Anthony Eden.
Mr. Chairman, fellow delegates, ladies and gentlemen, no more suitable setting could have been found anywhere for this assembly than the splendid city of San Francisco, one of the main centers of the United Nations war effort. San Francisco, whose confidence in the future is only equaled by its sense of comradeship today. Our deep gratitude, sir, is due to the city itself and to the whole state of California which with traditional hospitality has opened its gates to us, and also to the government and the people of the United States, who in a wider sense are our hosts at this momentous conference. We thank you, sir, and through you, all those who have helped to organize this conference for the labor which they have given so generously in the common cause. Sir, sir, we are met here in the shadow of a grievous loss. No one can speak in this assembly without recalling Franklin Roosevelt, the friend of free peoples, the good neighbor. He looked forward to continuing in peace that close association of the free nations which has brought us to the very edge of victory and from which the meeting today has sprung. It was he who named us the United Nations, and we shall best honor his memory by proving ourselves worthy of that proud title. So let us be clear about the purposes of this conference. We are not here to draft the terms of a treaty of peace. We are met to agree to set up a world organization which will help to keep the peace when the victory is finally won, as it will be, over both Germany and Japan. There have been moments in history when mankind has tried, by the creation of some international machinery, to solve disputes between nations by agreement and not by force. Hitherto, sir, all these endeavors have failed. Yet no one here doubts that despite these earlier failures, a further attempt must be made, and this time we must succeed. All the causes, and there were many, which made some form of international machinery desirable after the last war, make it indispensable today. In the last 100 years, and especially in the last 25 years, the discoveries of science have served to enrich and sometimes to endanger the work, but above all, to contract it. We have entered an age, and we would do well to remember it, when no natural barrier, whether mountain or ocean, can guarantee security against the new weapons which science has placed at the disposal of mankind. This hard fact is now biting deeply into the consciousness of all peoples, and they are, as I believe, ready to accept its implications and to shoulder the responsibilities which it imposes. Herein, ladies and gentlemen, lies the main difference between today and the lost opportunities at the end of the last World War. Today, this fact is patent to all. No one will dispute it. Whether we will or no, we are all now one another's neighbors. San Francisco is as close to Berlin or to Tokyo now as New York was to Washington 100 years ago. The world of today is one large city, and our countries are its several parishes. We are the citizens. Either together we must find some means of ordering our relations with justice and fair dealing, while allowing nations, great and small, full opportunity to develop their free and independent life. Either we must do that, or we shall soon head for another world conflict, which this time must bring utter destruction of civilization in its train. Ladies and gentlemen, it's no exaggeration to say that the work which we are starting on here in this meeting may be the world's last chance. That is why the governments of the 4 countries who sponsored the invitation to this conference asked their representatives to meet together and to work out proposals which might later form the basis of an international agreement. They did so at Dumbarton Oaks. Their work was examined and was completed in the Crimea. The final outcome is now before you. And now, sir, there are 1 or 2 brief observations about these proposals which I would make. In the first place, these proposals admittedly constitute a compromise. In the second place, they do not constitute an attempt by the 4 powers to dictate to the rest of the world what form the future world organization should take. They are suggestions which we present to you, which unitedly we present to you for your consideration. Nor, sir, are they intended to stand unchanged until the end of time. For our part, His Majesty's government in the United Kingdom are prepared to accept and endorse them and to do their best to give them life, because we believe that they can form a basis for a future world organization which will help to provide us with that security which is today mankind's greatest need. But, ladies and gentlemen, security is not itself a final end. It is indispensable if we are to make true freedom possible. Not otherwise can we hope to realize a world in which justice for nations as well as for individuals can prevail. But, ladies and gentlemen, this security cannot be created in a day, nor by any document, however admirable. It must be the product of time and of constant effort, of learning to work together, of practicing and upholding accepted standards of international conduct. The important thing is to begin now. Now, here, sir, let me sound a note of warning and make a suggestion. Let me say how emphatically I agree with your words of a short while ago. Let us not, at this session, attempt too much. We cannot hope here to produce a complete scheme, perfect in all its elaborate details, for the future ordering of the world under every possible circumstance. I am persuaded, on the contrary, that we should be wise to set ourselves a goal more within the compass of our immediate possibilities. We shall have taken the indispensable first step if we can now draw up a charter within the framework of our principles. The details can then be left to be filled in the light of experience. Well, I know that what I've said just now is essentially an Anglo-Saxon conception. And I'm conscious that there are others here, and that therefore their conception may be challenged by others. But, sir, I am convinced that in this particular case it is right, and I would claim that its merit is capable of proof by reference to historical facts. Now, sir, let me make a brief reference to the proposals themselves. So they impose obligations equally on all of us, on every power here represented. But I am conscious that a special responsibility lies on great powers in these days when industrial potential is so decisive a factor in military strength. Now, so great powers can make a twofold contribution. They can make it by their support of this organization. They can make it also by setting themselves certain standards in international conduct and by observing those standards scrupulously in all their dealings with other countries. Sir, the greater the power any state commands, the heavier its responsibility to wield that power with consideration for others and with restraint upon its own selfish impulses. So what was the most sinister feature of the years which immediately preceded the present struggle? It was, I submit to you, the deliberate debasement of international conduct in which Germany, Italy, and Japan engaged to further their own selfish plans. It was the practice of these powers not only persistently to violate their engagements, but to use new engagements, which they so readily undertook after each aggression, as a cloak to cover their next crime. That was the technique. And what was the result? There came a time when the outraged forces of civilization had to call a halt to these practices, and so inevitably the world was plunged into another war. Great powers have a special responsibility to guard against the recurrence of such practices. So I've laid emphasis on that portion of our task which is concerned with the provision of international machinery for the settlement of political disputes. But of equal importance with this is the solution of economic problems, which, if untended, can themselves sow the seeds of future war. This will be the task of the Social and Economic Council, which finds its place in the proposals now before you. It is our duty to ensure that this Council shall be well adapted to play its full part in our new structure of peace. Here then, sir, are our two immediate tasks, political and economic. Let us press them vigorously to a conclusion. World events of unprecedented magnitude, both in the East and in the West, crowd upon us at every hour. If we order our labors efficiently, if we work to the utmost of our strength, it should surely be possible for us to agree our charter within 4 weeks from now. Sir, I hope we shall set ourselves such a target and determine to reach it. We cannot afford to delay. This conference bears heavy responsibilities. It has also splendid opportunities. Let it seize them now. Ladies and gentlemen, before I conclude, I would just like to give you one experience which was mine in the early days of this war, which I think has perhaps its lesson for us all in the work we have to do. In the early days of this war, I went to Egypt to greet soldiers from Australia and from New Zealand who had come to their country to protect the Suez Canal against the imminent threat of Mussolini's aggression. On the evening after they'd arrived, I was speaking to a number of the men on the motives that have made them volunteer to come those many thousands of miles for this duty. And of the group, as we talked, one man remained quite silent. At last I turned to him and I said, "And what made you come here?" And he replied, "I guess there is a job of work to be done." Sir, in the last 6 terrible years, unnumbered men have died to give humanity another chance. Unnumbered men have died because they felt there was a job of work to be done. We too have a job of work to do if we are not to fail these men. Let us do it with courage, modesty, and dispatch. Let us do it now.
Anthony Eden, the Minister, Secretary for Foreign Affairs of the United Kingdom, has just concluded his formal opening address at the first plenary session of the United Nations Conference, and warm applause greets him as he shakes hands with Secretary of State Stettinius, who is presiding, and walks back to his seat in the midst of the United Kingdom delegation. And so we've concluded the first full plenary session of the United Nations Conference on International Organization at the San Francisco Opera House in San Francisco, with the speeches by the 4 chairmen of delegations of the 4 leading powers of the United States, Russia, China, and Great Britain. Secretary of State Stettinius opened our broadcast this afternoon in his address to the delegates, followed by the Commissar for Foreign Affairs of Soviet Russia, via Molotov, whose speech was followed with a translation in English and French, T.B. Sung, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of China, and the speech which you have just heard by Anthony Eden for Great Britain. This has been the first plenary session of the United Nations Conference in San Francisco, warmly and eagerly attended by the delegates here, the groups of consultants, and a listening world. And now it's time to pause for just a moment before further comment, to pause here in our NBC booth for station identification.